Berlin, West Germany, March 1978. The case file sat on my desk for 3 weeks before I opened it. Standard procedure when a walk-in claimed their spouse was a foreign operative. We received dozens every month. Jealous husbands, paranoid wives, people who'd watched too many spy films at the cinema. But this one had a photograph attached to the intake form, not of a person, of a pillow. And inside that pillow, barely visible through torn fabric, was a wire so thin it could have been a human hair. Except human hair doesn't connect to a magnetic tape cylinder the size of a lipstick tube. The intake officer who'd processed him had written one word in the margin, underlined twice: genuine. The man's name was Thomas Erdmann, 41 years old. Chemical engineer at BASF's industrial complex in Ludwigshafen, married 11 years, no children. No prior contact with any intelligence service, east or west. No criminal record. No debts. No mistresses. The kind of person who appears in no files anywhere, which, in our line of work, is either the mark of perfect innocence or a perfect cover. His wife, Christina, worked as a translator for a private export firm that handled technical manuals. They lived in a modest apartment in Mannheim. They took vacations to Lake Constance. They had dinner with her parents every Sunday. On paper, they were the definition of unremarkable. But Thomas Erdmann had found a recording device sewn into his wife's pillow. The one she insisted on bringing from her mother's house when they married. The one she claimed helped her sleep because it smelled like her childhood. And now he sat across from me in a windowless room in a building that didn't officially exist, while his wife presumably thought he was attending a 3-day conference in Hamburg. Before we go further into what Thomas Erdmann found that night, tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching this from? And if stories like this, the ones that show how the Cold War reached into bedrooms and pillows and the most intimate spaces of ordinary lives, interest you, consider subscribing. These cases don't appear in history books. They appear in files that were supposed to stay buried. Hit the like button and turn on notifications because what you're about to hear gets darker. Much darker. The Cold War wasn't fought with tanks rolling through Brandenburg Gate. It was fought in moments like these. In the space between a husband noticing his wife always slept facing away from him and the night he finally understood why. Between 1947 and 1991, the world divided itself into 2 armed camps, each convinced the other represented an existential threat to human civilization itself. The United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled enough nuclear weapons to exterminate all complex life on Earth 17 times over. But the real war, the one that consumed millions of lives without a single bomb falling, was the war of intelligence, the war of secrets. The war fought by people who looked like your neighbors, your colleagues, your spouse. In 1978, when Thomas Erdmann walked into our field office, both sides had been refining their techniques for 3 decades. The CIA's Operation Venona had long since decrypted Soviet cables from the 1940s, revealing the stunning scope of Moscow's penetration into Western governments and institutions. The KGB's Directorate S, responsible for illegals and sleeper agents, had perfected the art of creating human beings who existed on paper as perfectly as they did in flesh, complete biographies. Childhood memories implanted through repetition, emotional responses calibrated to match their cover identities. The Stasi's department, HVA, led by Markus Wolf, had turned East Germany into a surveillance state so thorough that an estimated 1 in every 63 citizens was an informant. These weren't the dramatic defections you saw in newspapers. The high-level officials who fled across the Glienicke Bridge in choreographed exchanges. This was something more insidious. This was the conversion of human intimacy itself into an intelligence product. By the late 1970s, technical surveillance had reached a level of sophistication that would have seemed like science fiction a generation earlier. The Americans had SIGINT capabilities that could intercept microwave transmissions bounced off the troposphere. The Soviets had laser microphones that could read vibrations off window glass from 200 meters away. But technology only got you so far. The human element remained irreplaceable. A recording device, no matter how miniaturized, was useless unless someone placed it in the right location. Unless someone knew where the target sat for breakfast, which room he used for private phone calls, which side of the bed he slept on. Unless someone had the kind of access that only comes from sharing a life with someone. The term for this was swallow in KGB parlance, though that specifically referred to female operatives using sexual relationships for intelligence purposes. What Thomas Erdmann described was something different, something that suggested longer-term planning. His wife wasn't a prostitute directed to seduce a target. She was, according to every document we could verify, exactly who she claimed to be. Christina Erdmann, née Vogel, born in Leipzig in 1946, daughter of a pharmacist and a schoolteacher, relocated to West Berlin with her family in 1959 during the brief window before the wall went up. She had school records, medical records, childhood friends who remembered her, a brother who lived in Stuttgart, the texture of a real life, not a constructed one. Which meant either we were looking at a false positive, a terrible coincidence, or we were looking at something planned so far in advance that the operator had been positioned before she'd even reached adolescence. Thomas Erdmann worked in industrial chemistry, specifically in the production of synthetic dyes and polymers. Not classified work. Not defense contracting. Nothing that would traditionally attract intelligence interest, but BASF in the 1970s was at the forefront of chemical engineering, developing processes that had applications beyond textiles and plastics. Catalytic converters, specialized polymers for aerospace, herbicides that were being tested for military defoliation purposes. Information that, in the right hands, could save the Soviets years of research and billions of rubles. But Thomas wasn't senior enough to access most of that information. He worked in quality control and process optimization for civilian production lines, the kind of position where you saw everything but controlled nothing, where you heard conversations in the cafeteria about projects 3 departments over, where you attended company-wide presentations about new directions in research, where you were exactly the kind of person who would never suspect he was valuable. His wife's firm, Techniksprachen GmbH, handled technical translations for export documentation, German to English, German to French, occasionally German to Russian, for the limited trade that occurred between West Germany and the Soviet bloc in supposedly non-strategic goods. The firm occupied 2 floors of an office building near Mannheim's Central train station. 12 employees. The owner was a former Wehrmacht translator who'd spent 3 years in a Soviet POW camp and came back speaking fluent Russian, the kind of detail that could cut either way. Either he hated the Soviets for what they'd done to him, or they'd turned him during those 3 years and sent him home to build exactly this kind of business. We checked. We always checked. He was clean. Bad knees from frostbite and nightmares about Stalingrad, but clean. Christina Erdmann translated technical manuals for agricultural machinery, industrial equipment, chemical processing documentation. She had security clearance for nothing. She handled no classified material. She worked standard hours, 9 to 5, took lunch at her desk, and went home to make dinner for her husband. She attended a book club on Thursday evenings. She played tennis on Sunday mornings. She voted in every election. She complained about the price of coffee and the traffic on the Autobahn and the neighbor's dog that barked at 5 in the morning. She was, by every measure we could apply, exactly what she appeared to be. Except for the pillow. Thomas had discovered it by accident. He'd been the kind of accident that seems absurd in retrospect, but perfectly logical in the moment. They'd been married 11 years. In that time, Christina had always slept with the same pillow, a cream-colored thing with faded floral embroidery that she claimed was the last item her grandmother had made before dying. She'd brought it from her mother's house when they married. She washed the pillowcase weekly, but insisted the pillow itself never needed washing, that it would ruin the filling. Thomas had never questioned this. People have their quirks. His mother had kept his father's reading glasses on the nightstand for 6 years after the man died. His brother refused to eat food that had been reheated in a microwave. A pillow that smelled like childhood seemed harmless enough. But in February 1978, their apartment building had a heating malfunction that lasted 4 days. The radiator in their bedroom cracked, spraying rusty water across the floor and soaking everything within 2 meters, including Christina's pillow. She'd been at work when it happened. Thomas had called her, expecting her to be upset about the mess, but not particularly concerned. Instead, she'd gone silent on the phone for 5 seconds. He counted them later, when he replayed the conversation in his mind, before saying she'd come home immediately. She arrived within 20 minutes, having left work claiming a family emergency. She picked up the soaked pillow and held it away from her body like it might explode. She said they needed to throw it away immediately, that it was ruined, that she'd find another one. Thomas had agreed, confused by her reaction but not alarmed. He'd put the pillow in a garbage bag and set it by the door to take down to the bins. But that night, he'd noticed Christina checking the bag 3 times before bed. In the morning, it was gone. She said she'd already taken it out. He didn't think about it again until 2 weeks later, when he was moving furniture to make room for a new bookshelf and found the pillow. Still damp, still sealed in the garbage bag, hidden in the back of their storage closet. It made no sense. Why claim to have thrown something away and then hide it in your own home? Why insist something was ruined and then keep it? Thomas had pulled the pillow out of the bag, intending to ask Christina about it when she got home. And that's when he'd seen it. A small tear in the seam, probably caused by the water damage, and through that tear something that didn't belong in a pillow. Something metallic. He'd used scissors to carefully widen the opening. Inside the cotton batting was a wire, thin as a thread, running from one end of the pillow to the other. He'd pulled gently, and more wire had emerged, connected to what looked like a tiny microphone. And beneath that, wrapped in waterproof plastic that had somehow failed, was a recording cylinder the size of his thumb, connected to a mechanism he didn't recognize, but that looked disturbingly purposeful. The whole assembly was no larger than a cigarette pack, sewn into the pillow's core so carefully that you could sleep on it every night and never feel its presence. Thomas Erdman was an engineer. He understood mechanisms. He understood that what he was looking at wasn't a commercial product, wasn't something you bought in a store. He understood that the only person who could have placed it inside the pillow was someone who'd had access to the pillow before it entered his home. And he understood that the only time that could have happened was before his marriage, when the pillow had been in his wife's possession at her mother's house, which meant either Christina had done this herself, or someone close to her had done it with her knowledge, or someone had done it without her knowledge but with access to her childhood bedroom. None of these options were comforting. He'd photographed the device with his Leica camera, using the macro lens he normally reserved for documenting manufacturing defects at work. He'd taken 12 photographs from different angles, then carefully sealed the pillow back in the garbage bag and returned it to the storage closet. He'd put everything back exactly as it had been. And then he'd gone to work the next morning as if nothing had happened, because he didn't know what else to do. He didn't know if his wife was a spy or a victim. He didn't know if his home was safe. He didn't know if his phone was tapped, if his car was followed, if the couple who'd moved in across the hall 6 months ago were his neighbors or his watchers. He didn't know anything anymore, except that the woman he'd shared a bed with for 11 years had brought a recording device into their marriage and positioned it so that it would capture every word he said in the moments before sleep, when people are at their most unguarded. He'd waited 3 days before coming to us. 3 days of sleeping next to Christina and pretending everything was normal. 3 days of wondering if she knew he'd found it. 3 days of replaying every conversation they'd ever had, every confidence he'd shared, every complaint about work, every speculation about office politics, every casual mention of colleague names and project timelines and production problems. 3 days of understanding that his marriage might have been, from its very beginning, a construction designed to extract information he'd never realized he possessed. The interview with Thomas Erdman lasted 7 hours. We conducted it in shifts, 2 officers at a time, cycling through to keep our attention sharp while his deteriorated standard technique. Not enhanced interrogation, nothing like that. We weren't trying to break him. We were trying to understand whether we were looking at a genuine penetration operation or an elaborate misunderstanding. The difference mattered. If Christina Erdman was a controlled agent, she represented one data point in a larger network that we needed to map before taking action. If she was operating independently, she was either a walk-in who'd been recruited after marriage or a long-term illegal who'd been positioned years in advance. If she was innocent, we were about to destroy 2 lives for no reason. We had to be certain. Thomas described his marriage in the kind of detail that only comes from reliving every moment with suspicion. They'd met in 1966 at a company social event. BASF hosted quarterly gatherings for employees and their families. Casual affairs meant to build morale and allow workers to network across departments. Christina had attended with her father, who'd recently retired from the pharmaceutical division. She was 20 years old, working as a secretary at a law firm, studying English and Russian at night school. Thomas was 29, 7 years into his career, comfortable but not ambitious. They'd talked about books. She'd been reading Hemingway in English. He'd been reading Günter Grass in German. They'd argued pleasantly about whether translation could ever truly capture an author's intent. She'd said something he remembered clearly. Every translation is a betrayal. But some betrayals are beautiful. He'd found that charming. They'd started seeing each other twice a week, then 4 times, then daily. 6 months later, he'd proposed. She'd said yes immediately, then cried for reasons she claimed were happiness. The wedding had been small. Her parents, her brother, his mother, a handful of friends. Her father had given a toast about finding stability in an unstable world. Her mother had seemed nervous, but mothers are always nervous at weddings. They'd honeymooned in Bavaria, hiking trails Thomas had known since childhood. Christina had loved the mountains. She'd said they reminded her of the Harz region near Leipzig, where she'd spent summers before her family fled east. They'd made love in a pension overlooking a lake whose name Thomas couldn't remember now. She'd cried afterward, and when he'd asked why, she'd said, "Because I'm happy, and I'm afraid of losing this." He'd found that touching at the time. Now it sounded like confession. Their married life had followed predictable patterns. Thomas worked. Christina worked. They saved money for a house they never quite managed to buy. They talked about children but never seriously pursued them. He'd assumed she was ambivalent. She'd said she wanted to wait until they were more financially secure. There was always a reason to wait. He'd accepted it because he'd assumed they had time. Now he wondered if children were incompatible with whatever her actual purpose was. If operatives were discouraged from having children who might compromise their mission with needs and attachment and the irrationality that comes from loving something more than the operation. We asked about her routines. She woke at 6:30 every morning. She made coffee and read the newspaper while Thomas showered. She left for work at 8:15. She returned home by 6:30 in the evening, unless her book club met. She cooked dinner 4 nights a week. They ate out or ordered takeaway the other 3. She watched television in the evenings, quiz shows and dramas, nothing political. She read before bed, usually fiction, sometimes technical material related to her translation work. She fell asleep by 11. She always slept with that pillow, positioned between her head and the headboard, which meant the microphone would have been oriented toward Thomas's side of the bed, toward where he lay in the dark, talking about his day, about frustrations with management, about which colleagues were competent and which were dead weight, about technical problems and their solutions, about everything a quality control engineer at a major chemical firm might know without realizing the value of what he knew. We asked about her friends. The book club consisted of 6 women, all wives of BASF employees or employees themselves. We'd check them. Her tennis partner was the wife of a physician, a woman named Monica whose political opinions ran toward the conservative and who'd once told Thomas at a dinner party that the wall should be electrified to prevent any more border crossings, unlikely handler material. Her mother lived in Heidelberg and called every Sunday morning at 9. Her father had died in 1975 of a heart attack. Her brother worked for Daimler-Benz in Stuttgart, married with 2 children, visited twice a year. No obvious points of contact with Eastern intelligence services, but we'd check them too. We'd check everyone. That's what Thomas didn't understand yet. Once you find one thread, you have to pull until the entire fabric reveals itself, or until you accept that the thread led nowhere. We asked about travel. They'd taken vacations to Austria, Switzerland, France, never east. Christina had said she had no desire to see the communist countries, that her memories of Leipzig before her family left were of grayness and fear, and her father whispering about people who'd disappeared. She'd seemed genuinely relieved to be in the West, but the best covers are built on emotional truth. The KGB had pioneered a technique in the 1950s, where they recruited people who genuinely believed in communism but were willing to express capitalist sentiments, who could pass polygraphs because they'd compartmentalized their beliefs so thoroughly that they experienced no stress when lying. True believers who'd learned to believe in two contradictory things simultaneously. Was Christina one of those? Or was she exactly what she seemed, and the pillow had been placed by someone else, and she was as much a victim as Thomas? We asked about sex. Thomas looked uncomfortable, but he answered, regular, but not passionate.
No.
2 or 3 times a week in the early years, tapering to once a week or less as the marriage settled. She'd never been particularly adventurous. She'd seemed to enjoy it, but not initiate it. She'd been responsive, but quiet. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested she was performing a role rather than living it. But then, Thomas admitted, he had no basis for comparison. She was his second sexual partner. The first had been a girlfriend in university who'd left him for a theology student. His experience was limited. Maybe Christina's restraint was normal. Maybe it was professional discipline. He didn't know anymore. We asked the question we always asked in these cases. Had he ever told her anything classified? He said no. His work wasn't classified. He had no security clearance. He handled civilian production processes for industrial dyes and polymers. Nothing sensitive. Nothing worth this kind of operation. But we pressed. Had he ever mentioned colleagues who worked in other divisions? Yes, of course. They socialized together. Had he ever discussed what those colleagues worked on? Sometimes, in general terms. Had he ever mentioned production problems that caused delays? Yes, those were regular topics of conversation at company events. Had he ever discussed new research directions? Only what was announced in internal newsletters. Had he ever mentioned personnel decisions, hirings, firings, promotions? Yes, that was normal office gossip. And that was the point. He didn't understand that normal office gossip from a BASF quality control engineer could provide a foreign intelligence service with valuable insight into production, capabilities, research priorities, personnel vulnerabilities, supply chain weaknesses. He didn't understand that a seemingly innocent mention of which department was hiring could reveal expansion in specific research areas. That complaints about delayed shipments of particular chemicals could indicate production bottlenecks in classified programs. That casual mentions of colleague expertise could help Moscow identify recruitment targets. Intelligence work isn't about stealing blueprints. It's about accumulating fragments of ordinary information until those fragments form a picture that reveals something not ordinary. We photographed the device he'd brought. We had technical specialists examine the photographs. Within 2 hours, we had a preliminary assessment. The microphone was a Soviet-manufactured Type 17 miniature condenser, typically used in short-range surveillance operations. The recording cylinder was a modified version of the system used in the East German Stasi's Operation Caro, a 1970s program to develop long-duration recording devices that could be placed in domestic settings. The mechanism included a voice-activated trigger, meaning it only recorded when people spoke, conserving battery and tape. The entire assembly would have been capable of recording approximately 20 hours of conversation. Before requiring service that would have required removing the device, replacing the tape cylinder, and reinstalling it. Service that could only have been performed by someone with regular, unsupervised access to the pillow. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what time are you watching this? And if you're starting to understand how the Cold War wasn't fought in bunkers and command centers, but in bedrooms and kitchens and the spaces where people thought they were safe, hit the like button. Subscribe if you want more of these cases. Turn on notifications because the way this ends is worse than you think. We had to determine whether Christina knew about the device. This was the central question everything else depended on. 3 scenarios presented themselves. First, she was an active agent who'd placed the device herself or arranged for its placement, who'd married Thomas specifically to access his conversations, who'd built an entire life as cover for an intelligence operation. Second, she'd been approached by a handler after marriage, threatened or blackmailed or persuaded to allow the device to be placed, operating under coercion rather than conviction. Third, the device had been placed without her knowledge by someone with access to her childhood home, possibly targeting her father during his time at BASF, and she'd innocently brought it into her marriage as an artifact of someone else's operation. We discussed options. Confronting her directly would reveal our knowledge and potentially trigger an emergency protocol on her end, alerting her handlers if she had them, causing her to flee or destroy evidence. Surveilling her would take weeks to establish patterns and might still reveal nothing if she was careful. Bringing her in for questioning would require legal justification we didn't have yet. Installing our own surveillance to monitor her behavior might show us what we needed, but it would also mean letting a potential operation continue while we watched. Every option carried risks. The decision was made above my clearance level. We would run a quiet background investigation while maintaining surveillance on both Thomas and Christina, without either of them knowing. Thomas would return home and resume normal life. He would tell his wife nothing about what he'd found or where he'd been. He would continue sleeping in the same bed, continue the same routines, continue being married to a woman who might be documenting his every word. We told him this was necessary to protect the investigation. We didn't tell him it was also to see if he could maintain the deception, if he had the discipline to live a double life, which would tell us something about whether his wife had managed the same thing for 11 years. Thomas agreed because he had no real choice. When a man discovers his marriage might be an intelligence operation, he enters a space where normal rules don't apply, where the state tells you to go home and pretend everything is fine while we determine whether to destroy your life, where your cooperation is mandatory because refusing would make you look like an accomplice. Thomas left our facility at 9 in the evening, drove home, and arrived to find Christina cooking dinner as if it were any other Thursday. He'd been gone 3 days. She asked about the conference in Hamburg. He repeated the cover story we'd prepared. She seemed to believe him, or seemed to believe him. He couldn't tell anymore. That's what this kind of suspicion does to you. It destroys your ability to read the person you thought you knew better than anyone. Our investigation began that night. We pulled everything we could access without warrants or official requests, which was substantial in 1978 West Germany. Christina's employment record showed steady, unremarkable work at Techniksprachen GmbH for the past 8 years. Before that, she'd worked at the law firm Thomas mentioned, and before that, she'd been a student. We interviewed her former employers using pretext calls, claiming to verify employment for a routine security clearance for a client she'd never heard of. Everyone described her the same way: punctual, competent, quiet, professional, unmemorable. The kind of person you could work next to for years without forming strong opinions about them. That could mean innocence or excellent cover. We examined her family history more carefully. Her father, Werner Vogel, had worked at BASF from 1960 until his retirement in 1965. Production. Supervisor in the pharmaceutical division, which handled both civilian medications and certain chemical precursors that had military applications. He'd had basic security clearance, nothing high level, but enough to make him aware of what the company produced beyond aspirin and antibiotics. He died 3 years ago. Medical records confirm natural causes, heart attack at age 62. His wife, Christina's mother, was a retired schoolteacher. No political affiliations. No travel outside Western Europe. We found nothing suspicious, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The brother, Martin Vogel, worked as a production manager at Daimler-Benz. Another industrial position. Another company with both civilian and defense contracts. Married, children, owned his home, paid his taxes, voted CDU, attended Catholic Mass on major holidays. We ran surveillance on him for 2 weeks. Nothing. He went to work. Came home, played with his children, drank beer on Saturday evenings with neighbors. If he was part of a network, he was either inactive or so disciplined that he showed no indicators. We looked at Christina's childhood in Leipzig before her family fled to the West. Records from East Germany were difficult to access, but we had sources. What we learned was unremarkable. Werner Vogel had worked as a pharmacist in a state hospital. The family had lived in a standard apartment block. Christina had attended the local school. In 1959, when Christina was 13, the family had relocated to West Berlin, officially because Werner had been offered a better position at a pharmaceutical company there. They'd crossed legally before the wall made such crossings impossible. Thousands of families did the same thing in the late 1950s, sensing which way the political wind was blowing. Nothing about their departure suggested they'd been plants sent west with long-term instructions to integrate and wait for activation. But we'd seen long-term operations before. We knew the KGB's second chief directorate had experimented with programs that positioned assets years or even decades before activation. We knew that Marcus Wolf's HVA had run operations where teenage children of loyal party members were sent west with their families, raised as Western citizens, and only activated in adulthood when their cover was ironclad. We knew that what looked like innocent defection in 1959 could have been the opening move in a game that didn't reach its critical phase until 1967, when Christina met Thomas Erdmann. We surveilled Christina for 6 weeks. She went to work, came home, attended her book club, played tennis, visited her mother. We recorded her phone calls. All mundane. We photographed everyone she interacted with. We found no pattern of contact with known intelligence operatives or suspected agents. We installed a probe in her office at Techniksprachen GmbH, hidden in the light fixture above her desk. We heard her translate technical manuals, chat with colleagues about television programs, complain about a persistent cough. Nothing operational. If she was active, she was either communicating through channels we couldn't detect, or she'd been instructed to go dormant after Thomas discovered the device. That was the problem with this kind of investigation. Negative findings meant nothing. The absence of suspicious behavior could indicate innocence, or it could indicate professional discipline. The longer we watched without seeing anything incriminating, the more we had to consider that either Christina was innocent or she was so well trained that our surveillance was inadequate. And if our surveillance was inadequate, we were dealing with a level of operational sophistication that suggested Moscow Center or Department X, the KGB's most elite illegal operations unit. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his normal life under conditions that would have broken most people. He went to work. He came home, he ate dinner with his wife, he watched television with her. He made love to her twice during those 6 weeks, both times initiating because he thought refusing would seem suspicious. He said it felt like violation, like raping someone while being raped simultaneously, because he didn't know if she was a willing participant in their marriage or if she was performing a role while documenting his performance of his. He lost 12 pounds. He started having panic attacks in the bathroom at work. He developed insomnia, which was darkly ironic because the entire investigation centered on recordings made while he slept. We met with him weekly, always at different locations, always using protocols designed to ensure Christina couldn't detect his absence. He'd tell her he was attending evening seminars on new quality control methodologies. He'd tell her he was helping a colleague with a project. He'd tell her anything except the truth, which was that he was being debriefed by intelligence officers who were trying to determine whether his marriage was real. During these meetings, we asked him to remember specific conversations he'd had with Christina over the years. What had he told her about work, about colleagues, about company politics, about technical problems? He'd tried to remember, but memory under stress becomes unreliable. He'd start recounting something, then doubt whether it had happened the way he remembered or whether his suspicion was reshaping the past. We'd press him. He'd break down. We'd give him time to recover. Then we'd press again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. We'd been examining Christina's translation work, looking for patterns in the documents she handled. Most were exactly what they appeared to be: technical manuals for industrial equipment being exported to various countries. But one series of documents caught our attention. Over the past 3 years, she'd translated approximately 40 technical manuals related to chemical processing equipment manufactured by various West German firms. The translations were into Russian. The client was listed as VEB, Chemische Werkbühne, an East German state chemical enterprise operating under the supervision of the Ministry for Chemistry. This was entirely legal. East-West trade in non-strategic goods was permitted, even encouraged as a gesture of détente. Chemical processing equipment for producing synthetic rubber and plastics fell into the permitted category. But the volume was interesting. 40 manuals in 3 years meant roughly 1 per month. Not enough to seem unusual. Just enough to be statistically significant. We pulled the original German manuals and compared them to Christina's Russian translations. Her work was accurate, professional, but we noticed something. In several cases, she'd translated technical appendices that weren't formally part of the manuals required for operating the equipment. Appendices that discussed process optimization, theoretical yield improvements, alternative chemical pathways. Information that wasn't classified, but that could be valuable to someone trying to improve their own production capabilities without conducting independent research. This still wasn't proof of espionage. Translating publicly available technical documents wasn't illegal, but it established a pattern of information flow from West German chemical industry knowledge to East German chemical industry interests, with Christina Erdmann serving as a conduit. Combined with the device in her pillow and the fact that her husband worked at BASF, it began to form a picture. We decided to test her, not directly, but through Thomas. We instructed him to casually mention during dinner conversation that BASF was experiencing production problems with a new catalytic process for polymer synthesis. This was true. We'd confirmed it with sources inside the company. But the information wasn't classified, wasn't secret. Was simply the kind of technical difficulty that any large chemical firm experiences regularly. We told Thomas to mention it as workplace gossip, the way a husband might complain about his day to his wife. To say that the problem was frustrating his colleagues, that they'd tried 17 different approaches without success, that management was getting impatient. Thomas had the conversation on a Tuesday evening in late April. He mentioned the production problem while they were eating dinner. Christina listened, asked a few questions about what specifically wasn't working, then changed the subject to a television program she wanted to watch later. Normal spousal response. We'd recorded the conversation using a device we'd hidden in their kitchen during a weekend when they'd both been out. Nothing in Christina's demeanor suggested she recognized the information as valuable or was making mental notes to report it. But 3 days later, something happened. Christina called in sick to work on Friday morning, claiming a migraine. This wasn't unusual. She'd called in sick 4 times in the past year, always for plausible reasons. But this was the first time since we'd started surveillance. We had a team watching her apartment. She left at 10 in the morning, drove to a pharmacy, purchased aspirin and a magazine, then drove to her mother's house in Heidelberg, 40 kilometers away. She stayed there for 2 hours. Our surveillance team photographed her entering and leaving. They couldn't see what happened inside without risking exposure. We interviewed the mother later under pretext, a woman claiming to be conducting a survey about consumer preferences. The mother mentioned her daughter had visited that Friday, said Christina had seemed stressed about work, had asked if she could borrow some old family photographs because she was making a memory album. The mother had given her a box of photographs from a storage closet. Christina had looked through them, selected several, then returned the box. Normal daughter behavior. Except Christina had never mentioned making a memory album to Thomas. And she'd chosen that specific Friday, 3 days after Thomas mentioned the production problem at BASF, to visit her mother's house and access materials stored in a closet. We considered the possibility that the photographs were a communication method. Dead drops sometimes used innocuous objects like family photos to conceal microfilm or written reports. But we couldn't retrieve the photos without revealing our surveillance. We could only watch and wait and document.